At the end of World War II, German submarines went from being the most feared weapon in the Atlantic to becoming key pieces in a secret division of resources among the victorious powers. Some were deliberately sunk, others studied in silence, and many disappeared under agreements that were never made public. This is the story of what happened to the German submarine fleet when the conflict ended and a new era began in the shadows of the ocean. The power of the German submarine, the terrifying weapon that changed the war. German submarine power, as we know it through the dreaded U-boats, did not emerge overnight, nor was it simply the technological product of a regime obsessed with total war. Its origins date back decades earlier, to the early years of the 20th century, when the German Empire watched with growing concern British naval dominance. By then, the Royal Navy was the undisputed maritime power of the world, and any German attempt to match it on the surface was as costly as it was improbable. It was in this context that some visionary officers, daring engineers, and innovative strategists began to consider that the key to confronting a superior enemy lay not in building more battleships, but in developing a completely different force. Silent, invisible, and capable of striking from the depths. The first German prototypes were humble and experimental, almost fragile compared to the steel behemoths that would dominate the oceans decades later. But even in those initial designs lay the seeds of a military revolution. The German Empire understood that the submarine should not simply be a complement to the fleet, but a strategic weapon with devastating potential. World War I would confirm this view. With an inferior surface navy, Germany turned to its submarines to cut British supply lines, and it quickly became clear that a small vessel, submerged silently and armed with accurate torpedoes, could cause more damage than an entire battleship. It was during that war that the term U-boat became synonymous with an invisible threat. Despite Germany's defeat in 1918, submarine power did not disappear. The Treaty of Versailles officially prohibited Germany from possessing submarines, but the reality was quite different. German engineers and officers traveled to foreign shipyards, participated in design programs in other countries, and kept their knowledge alive. Under the guise of inactivity, Germany was quietly preparing the revival of its submarine force. When the Nazi regime took power in 1933, it found a willing technical body, secretly accumulated knowledge, and a clear vision of the weapon that could break the British blockade if a new conflict arose. This renaissance culminated in the development of the Third Reich's first generations of U-boats. Germany began by building modest models, intended for training and coastal operations, but quickly evolved into ocean-going submarines capable of crossing the Atlantic. By the mid-1930s, German shipyards were already mass-producing vessels that combined speed, range, and reliability. The Reich's leadership knew that these submarines would be fundamental to any future strategy and that the German surface force could never match the British. The ocean thus became the battleground where the Germans would seek to alter the global balance of power. With the outbreak of World War II, German submarine power entered its golden age. U-boats, led by experienced commanders, began a campaign in the Atlantic that nearly crippled the British economy. In the early years of the conflict, German submarines sank hundreds of merchant ships, isolating Britain from its colonies, cutting off the flow of food and supplies and jeopardizing the Allied war effort. It was an asymmetrical war. While the British relied on huge, slow convoys, the U-boats attacked them from invisibility, sliding lethal torpedoes through the night waves. German submarine power relied not only on the bravery of its crews, but also on the application of innovative tactics. The famous wolf pack, a method in which several submarines coordinated simultaneous attacks, allowed the Kriegsmarine to strike from multiple angles and overwhelm enemy defenses. These coordinated attacks transformed the Atlantic into a hostile environment where every merchant ship lived under the constant threat of a submarine attack. The ocean, once a silent witness to global trade, became an invisible minefield. Despite initial successes, German submarine power was not invincible. As the war progressed, the Allies developed new technologies such as radar, improved sonar, Enigma decoding, and the use of escort carriers patrolling the Atlantic skies. This marked the beginning of a technological war that spurred Germany to innovate even faster. In response to mounting losses, German engineers began working on revolutionary models that would change the very concept of what a submarine could be. Thus were born the legendary Type 21 and Type 23 submarines, designed not for occasional submersion, but to live in the underwater world. Unlike previous models, which had to surface frequently to recharge their batteries, these new designs could remain submerged for extended periods, move faster underwater than on the surface, and utilize revolutionary propulsion systems. The Type 21, in particular, represented a leap of several decades in naval technology. It had an advanced hydrodynamic hull, more powerful batteries, improved acoustic systems, and a level of automation that no other country had achieved. Had this submarine been deployed en masse before the end of the war, the history of the Atlantic might have been very different. German submarine power also transformed the world's perception of naval warfare. Its tactics, innovations, and ability to operate in complete darkness established a standard that all the major powers would subsequently study. The U-boats demonstrated that a country did not need a massive fleet to challenge its enemy's maritime dominance. Small, silent, and strategically employed vessels were sufficient. This philosophy defined naval warfare in the decades that followed. Even as Nazi Germany was collapsing, its submarine engineering continued to evolve and shape the future. The psychological impact of the U-boats was also enormous. For years, the mere mention of these submarines instilled fear in sailors, political leaders, and ordinary citizens. The Atlantic, which for centuries had symbolized the connection between continents, became a space of deadly uncertainty. German submarine warfare proved that no country, however powerful, was completely safe if it did not control the depths of the ocean. This power was not born by chance. It was the result of decades of innovation, secrecy, technical daring, and a profound understanding of maritime geostrategy. Germany did not just build submarines, it shaped a naval philosophy, a way of thinking about warfare, and a technology that would change the world. From its experimental origins before World War I to its technological peak in 1945, German submarine power became a symbol of terror, ingenuity, and transformation. Even today, when studying the development of modern submarine fleets, it is impossible not to find traces of those machines that silently traversed the depths of the Atlantic. Their legacy lives on in the design of nuclear-powered submarines, in the tactical doctrines of the great naval powers, in the hydrodynamic architecture of modern hulls, and in the conviction that supremacy at sea is not decided solely on the surface, but also in the unfathomable darkness of the ocean. German submarine power was more than a military force. It was a silent revolution that forever changed how warfare was waged at sea. From its humble beginnings to its central role in World War II, its story chronicles how a nation transformed a weapon into a legacy that continues to breathe, invisible and deep beneath the waters of time. The collapse of the Reich and the order to surrender. In the final months of World War II, the Third Reich was in a state of disintegration that not even the most fervent propaganda machine could conceal. German cities were reduced to smoldering ruins. The railway infrastructure was continually collapsing under Allied bombing, and the army, which had once advanced with almost mechanical precision across half of Europe, was now retreating chaotically before an enemy that had regained the initiative on all fronts. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was living not only its last days, but its last hours, bleeding from within and being crushed from without. At the heart of this maelstrom was the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, which, while never enjoying the same priority of resources as the Luftwaffe or the ground forces, had developed a submarine force whose reputation had reached mythical levels during the early years of the conflict. Despite their subsequent defeats, the U-boats continued to be perceived by the Allies as formidable enemies. Even in late 1944, when German naval power was waning, the mere sighting of a German submarine anywhere in the Atlantic was enough to put an entire transport convoy on high alert. But reality was different from the image that propaganda had constructed. The U-boats had gone from being relentless hunters to constant prey. The Atlantic in 1945 was no longer the dark and silent stage where German submarines could stalk with impunity. It had become an ocean teeming with eyes and ears, airborne radar, constant patrols, increasingly sophisticated escorts, and anti-submarine techniques that had been perfected after years of war. At German naval bases, what had once been an atmosphere of discipline and order began to transform into a climate of tension, secrecy, and demoralization. Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, and the Baltic shipyards registered reports of undelivered supplies, defective torpedoes, and incomplete units ordered to sea before they were fully operational. And yet the chain of command insisted the submarines had to sail. Morale was quietly crumbling. The most senior officers whispered that the war was lost, but publicly they maintained the rhetoric of absolute resistance demanded by the regime. The final months were marked by internal contradictions. New designs, such as the revolutionary Type 21 and Type 23, promised a rebirth of the submarine force, an opportunity to reverse Allied superiority. But time was no longer on Germany's side. Shipyards were being frequently bombed, supplies were running low, and training was reduced to accelerated programs incapable of adequately preparing the new crews. What could have been a key technological leap in the future of naval warfare came too late to change the fate of the Reich. By March 1945, the U-boat commanders who were still operational were receiving increasingly confusing reports. Communications were constantly being interrupted, and orders reaching the units at sea were often outdated or contradicted later ones. The command structure was collapsing from within. The submarines were navigating blindly, not only in the literal sense of underwater stealth, but also symbolically. They were operating without reliable information about the overall strategic context. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the situation was completely unraveling. Hitler, surrounded by loyalists who no longer believed in victory, continued to demand senseless sacrifices. The Navy was receiving orders from a remote bunker that was completely out of touch with operational reality. They were ordered to fight to the last man, to battle on all fronts, and to continue attacking heavily fortified convoys, even though doing so was a sure death sentence. For the U-boat commanders, who had already seen thousands of submariners die in the preceding years, these orders bordered on utter irrationality. With the fall of Berlin imminent, many Kriegsmarine officers began to act with a pragmatism that the political leadership had abandoned. Decisions were made that directly contradicted official orders, avoiding impossible combat engagements, preserving the lives of crews, delaying deployments to sea with technical excuses. Military morale had clashed head-on with the human reality of a lost conflict. But even so, the Nazi hierarchical apparatus continued to function, albeit like a rusty machine. On April 30th, 1945, the news of Hitler's death struck German command centers like thunder. With his suicide, the last thread of ideological cohesion was severed. His political testament, in which he named Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, surprised many. He was neither a political leader nor a land strategist. He was a naval officer. But perhaps that was precisely why he was chosen, because he still maintained a functional military structure and because he possessed the necessary discipline to manage the remnants of the German state. However, the task he received was almost impossible: to govern a defeated country, incapable of resistance and on the verge of total occupation. Dönitz assumed command in a desperate climate. He understood from the outset that continuing the war was not only futile but dangerous for millions of civilians. His priority was to negotiate an orderly surrender, preferably to the British and Americans, hoping to prevent the USSR from occupying more territory. For this, he needed time, and any tool would do. The U-boats, despite their critical condition, represented a bargaining chip. Keeping them operational allowed Germany to demonstrate that it still possessed military capability and that a disorderly surrender could result in further losses of Allied lives and vessels. But this political maneuver was extremely delicate. Any further submarine attack could immediately harden Allied conditions. Therefore, after days of calculations and deliberations within a barely functioning government, Dönitz made the most momentous decision of his brief tenure: to order a complete cessation of U-boat offensive operations. The message, issued on May 4th, spread slowly through the naval communication channels that were still operational. For the submariners, receiving the order was a moment charged with conflicting emotions. Some felt relief after years of facing almost certain death. Others, true to the military ideal instilled in them since their youth, received it with shame, even anger. Surrender was a concept that clashed head-on with the upbringing of a naval elite trained to resist to the bitter end. And yet, they understood that the end had come, that the war could not be prolonged any longer, and that any act of resistance would only result in more death, more destruction, and more pointless suffering. The submarines began to surface, some in the middle of the Atlantic, others in icy seas, and still others near hostile coasts. They communicated with yesterday's enemies, reporting their position and their willingness to surrender. Many were running extremely low on fuel, others were sailing with engines on the verge of failure, and some had been damaged by recent depth charges. The crews emerged on deck in tattered uniforms, their faces gaunt from strain and fear, and with the feeling of having survived a hell from which thousands of others had not escaped. When the total surrender was signed on May 8th, known as VE Day, the definitive fall of the Reich was sealed. The final order, transmitted to every ship flying the German flag, was clear: cease operations, surrender without resistance, and proceed to the ports designated by the Allies. With this, not only German submarine warfare ended, but an entire era marked by the silent struggle on the oceans, by advanced technology, and by the extreme sacrifice of those who served aboard. The surrender of the U-boats became an iconic image of the end of the conflict. Dozens of submarines emerging like specters in enemy ports, surrendering their flags, silencing their engines forever. It was the symbolic end of the power Germany once wielded in the depths, an end that marked the demise of an empire built on control, fear, violence, and unbridled ambition. An end that also opened the door to the complete transformation of naval warfare in the post-war era: distribution and study of submarines. When Nazi Germany signed its surrender in May 1945, the Allies faced an unexpected challenge, deciding what to do with the world's most technologically advanced submarine fleet. The U-boats, which had sown terror in the Atlantic during the early years of the war, were now highly coveted pieces of engineering by the victorious powers. What followed was not simply the division of captured war material. It was a silent race to appropriate the knowledge accumulated by the Kriegsmarine during a decade of intensive industrial development. Military victory gave way to a new, more subtle but equally decisive competition: the technological race that would define the future of global submarine warfare. The exact number of submarines in the hands of the Allies was enormous. Between operational units, damaged vessels, advanced models still in shipyards, and prototypes never deployed, there were more than 100 hulls, each representing a level of engineering that in many cases surpassed Allied technology at the beginning of 1945. To ensure a fair distribution, the major victorious powers agreed on a system that would allow each to obtain both complete units and examples of the most significant advancements. However, behind the formal meetings, they were all after the same thing: the Type 21 and Type 23 submarines, the true technological treasures of the Reich. The United States acted swiftly. As soon as the commanders of several U-boat flotillas began surrendering in the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy deployed specialized teams to inspect each vessel. Captured submarines were towed to ports such as Portsmouth and New London, where engineers and naval officers began a meticulous evaluation process. For the Americans, these submarines were windows into the future: optimized hydrodynamic hulls, efficient electrical systems, high-capacity batteries, an internal design aimed at reducing mechanical noise, and above all, the ability to operate submerged for longer periods thanks to charging and propulsion technologies ahead of their time. Engineers were particularly impressed by the architecture of the Type 21. Its elongated shape, smooth lines, and minimal water resistance made it the first submarine truly designed to operate below the surface, not simply for occasional submersion. The Americans dismantled many of these submarines piece by piece, studying every valve, every engine, every electrical system. Some units underwent intensive open-sea testing. Even in their captured state, many demonstrated performance that astonished U.S. naval engineers. The result was immediate. The U.S. Navy began incorporating elements of the German design into its own projects. Without the captured U-boats, the technological leap that eventually led to U.S. nuclear submarines would have been much slower. In fact, several U.S. officers confessed decades later that the Type 21 had been the conceptual basis for an entire generation of post-war submarines. The United Kingdom, for its part, adopted a more thorough and meticulous approach. British experts, aware that Germany had invested colossal resources in improving its submarines even in the most desperate moments of the war, set out to study every detail with the precision of a scientific laboratory. At the Rosyth shipyards and Royal Navy technical facilities, British engineers dismantled numerous U-boats and subjected them to a comprehensive documentation process. The British did not simply want to adopt German technologies, they wanted to understand why certain solutions had worked so well and why others had failed. The British trials included immersion tests, noise assessments, hydrodynamic studies, and materials analysis. In several cases, captured submarines were used as experimental platforms on actual missions, allowing for direct comparison with British models. For the Royal Navy, the lesson was clear. German technological development was several steps ahead of its own in terms of conceptual design. By the mid-1940s, many British engineers acknowledged that Germany had broken paradigms that Britain had not yet dared to challenge. The knowledge gained during this period became the basis for the first post-war British submarines and later influenced the design of the first British nuclear submarines. The Soviet Union, although initially receiving fewer submarines than the United States or the United Kingdom, was perhaps the power that benefited most from the division of resources. The Soviets were particularly interested in the most modern models. They captured several submarines in the Baltic, including some incomplete but perfectly functional Type 21 submarines. For Soviet engineers, these submarines were strategic treasures. Before the war, the Soviet submarine fleet was large but technologically outdated. After studying U-boats, the situation changed dramatically. Soviet teams moved the captured submarines to Leningrad and other naval facilities, where they began a phase of intensive study. The USSR didn't just observe, it took notes, copied systems, and adapted each German innovation to its mass production philosophy. It wasn't long before Soviet shipyards began producing submarines based directly on German engineering. Many of the Soviet submarines that patrolled the oceans during the early years of the Cold War carried the technical legacy of the Type 21 and 23 in their DNA. This gave the USSR an initial advantage in the field of submarine warfare, which until then had been dominated by American and British expertise. France also acquired several U-boats, temporarily incorporating them into its navy while it rebuilt its naval capabilities, which had been severely hampered by years of occupation and economic devastation. French engineers studied the captured submarines to develop their first modern post-war models. The Netherlands, Norway, and other European states also received units, although their research capabilities were more limited. Even so, for these smaller navies, access to German technology represented a significant leap forward. The allocation was not without diplomatic tensions. Although officially there was talk of an equitable agreement between the major powers, in reality each nation maneuvered to obtain the most advanced models. The competition for the Type 21 submarines was particularly intense. There were even recorded incidents in which submarines heading to surrender at a specific port were redirected by naval patrols from another power in order to capture them first. It was a silent race, without shots fired, but laden with strategic importance. Each country knew that the future of submarine warfare would be decided by the studies being conducted in those final months. In addition to the submarines themselves, the Allies also seized a massive amount of documentation: blueprints, technical reports, engineering notebooks, experimental notes, and advanced projects that were never fully realized. This documentation, scattered throughout German naval installations and research centers, contained secrets that no victorious nation was willing to ignore. Kriegsmarine reports revealed advanced hydrodynamic calculations, underwater acoustic studies, state-of-the-art torpedo designs, and plans for even more ambitious submarines, some of them conceptually close to the technology that, decades later, would enable the development of stealth submarines and advanced propulsion systems. A key part of the Allied study focused on understanding how Germany had managed to combine such innovative elements in mass-produced submarines during a total war. Analysis of the German naval industry showed that even under constant bombing, the shipyards had continued to produce advanced models, thanks to a highly disciplined system of technical coordination. By studying the German industrial process, Allied engineering teams learned lessons about modular design, assembly efficiency, and structural solutions that they would later adopt in their own production lines. The true impact of these studies was not limited to the immediate post-war decade. Many German innovations continued to influence international submarine development throughout the 1950s and 60s. Even the most modern nuclear submarines inherited concepts that originated in the laboratories and shipyards of the Reich. hull shape, compartment orientation, internal noise reduction, and the focus on underwater autonomy all stemmed from studies conducted on captured U-boats. Allied engineers did not merely replicate German technology, they refined it, combined it with their own advancements, and projected it into the future. The division of German submarines, far from being a mere administrative act after the war, became an event that redefined the history of global submarine warfare. It was the point at which the victorious powers took the accumulated knowledge of a defeated enemy and transformed it into the foundation of their own modern fleets. What was created to serve the interests of the Reich ended up, in an ironic twist of fate, boosting the military capabilities of those who had defeated it, and with that, a new era began, the era of submarine technological competition that would define the Cold War. The Reich's secret race for underwater technology. Following the German surrender, as the world celebrated the end of the most devastating war in history, a new, much quieter and more hidden conflict began, waged in laboratories, shipyards, intelligence offices, and diplomatic corridors. It was a war without armies or visible fronts, but with profound and lasting consequences. Its objective was not to conquer territories, but to seize the future. The Reich's submarine technology, an engineering feat that had advanced at an astonishing pace even when German defeat was already inevitable. This was the secret race for dominance of the deep, a struggle that would shape the post-war naval landscape and play a central role in Cold War military strategy. During the final years of the conflict, Germany had invested colossal resources in developing submarines capable of restoring its superiority in the Atlantic. The Kriegsmarine knew that the war, if it was to be won, depended heavily on disrupting Allied supply lines. Although they ultimately failed, the advances that emerged from those years of desperation were remarkable. The development of the Type 21, a submarine designed to operate almost entirely submerged, broke with traditional naval design philosophy. Its ability to dive for extended periods, its efficient electric propulsion, the significant improvement in its batteries and its advanced hydrodynamic structure made it a machine far superior to any Allied model of the time. When the Allies began occupying German territory, many of these projects were still in advanced stages of construction. Shipyards like those in Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel housed incomplete prototypes, disassembled engineering components, experimental blueprints, and laboratories where scientists and engineers had worked feverishly in the final months of the war. The information was not only valuable, it was almost incalculable. And each power knew that whoever obtained it first would also gain a military advantage for decades. Officially, the sharing of these findings was to be coordinated between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. However, the reality was far more fraught. None of the Allies truly wanted to share their findings. Teams tasked with inspecting German installations sometimes operated without informing the other powers, secretly taking documents and concealing strategic discoveries. From the wreckage of the German defeat emerged a new kind of espionage among the Allies. The Americans were particularly quick to identify the key locations where the most valuable documents were kept. Their technical units, many of them linked to the newly created Naval Scientific Intelligence, arrived at several laboratories before the British or Soviets. When they did, they seized everything they found: blueprints, notebooks, prototypes, internal parts of mechanisms, even experimental machines that hadn't even been tested. They often left behind empty facilities like abandoned shells that no longer held any useful secrets. The British, aware that the German naval industry was 2 or 3 generations ahead in certain aspects, implemented their own technological recovery campaign. Royal Navy experts scoured devastated cities, bombed shipyards and underground depots. In many cases, they discovered that the Americans had arrived first. In others, they managed to find parts that had gone unnoticed by other delegations. It wasn't just about obtaining complete submarines, it was about understanding how Germany had managed to integrate thousands of mechanical and electrical components into designs that seemed to belong to another era. The Soviet Union, for its part, faced a different dilemma. Its troops had advanced across vast swathes of German territory and captured numerous naval installations in the Baltic, but a crucial portion of the documentation had been destroyed in the final days of the war or moved westward, escaping the Soviet advance. Even so, The Soviets managed to acquire several modern submarines, incomplete Type 21 prototypes, and, above all, German scientists and engineers who preferred to cooperate rather than face the consequences of defeat. Many of these technicians would be discreetly recruited into secret programs to bolster the nascent Soviet submarine fleet. It wasn't just a technical race, but a human one as well. Competition among the major powers to recruit the best German engineers intensified rapidly. The United States had launched Operation Paperclip, whose objective was to lure German scientists with promises of work and stability in exchange for their expertise. The Soviet Union, for its part, developed its own covert programs to transfer engineers to Soviet laboratories. In many cases, these recruitments were carried out in secret, without publicly revealing the true identities of the captured technicians. The Reich's technology was not only the spoils of the century, it was also a fundamental component in the development of missiles, advanced aircraft, and, of course, the submarine weapons of the future. The rivalry between the superpowers soon manifested itself in concrete projects. The United States began redesigning its submarines based on German principles: a more aerodynamic hull, improved battery systems, and reduced internal noise through a more efficient arrangement of engines and mechanisms. The United Kingdom, which had suffered greatly during the Battle of the Atlantic, understood the need to modernize its fleet to maintain its role as a naval power. And the USSR, which until then had robust but technically limited submarines, began an accelerated transformation based on the meticulous study of the Type 21. The result was immediate. In less than 10 years, the world witnessed the emergence of new generations of submarines that, although flying different flags, shared a common route: German engineering from the final months of the war. The American submarines of the Guppy class and later showed direct influences from German design. Post-war British submarines adopted hydrodynamic solutions inspired by U-boats. And in the Soviet Union, the Project 613 series of submarines, known as the Whiskey class, bore so many similarities to the Type 21 that many naval experts of the period classified that model as a direct descendant. Each power took a part of the German legacy and made it the foundation of its submarine strategy. But the Reich's secret technological race wasn't limited to naval engineering. It also encompassed torpedo systems, stealth methods, operational strategies, and logistical models developed by the Kriegsmarine. The Allies took detailed notes on silent patrol methods, coded communication systems, and depth charge evasion procedures. Much of this knowledge would be incorporated into post-war submarine warfare manuals, shaping naval doctrine throughout the Cold War. The silence surrounding this technological race was almost total. Most details were never officially revealed. Technical reports remained classified for decades. Even today, many operations to recover German documentation continue to be shrouded in secrecy. The public narrative spoke of the Allied victory, the fall of Nazism, and the reconstruction of Europe. But behind that official story, another battle was being waged. The struggle to dominate the ocean depths with machines born of German desperation, but perfected by the powers that defeated it. The legacy of that secret race can be traced in the architecture of all modern submarines. The hull shape, the compartment layout, the philosophy of acoustic stealth, the importance of underwater autonomy. All these elements originated in Germany in 1944 and 1945. And although the Reich fell into ruin, its submarine technology not only survived, it became the cornerstone of contemporary naval warfare. What began as a desperate quest by Germany to regain control of the Atlantic ended up being the catalyst for a technological revolution that forever changed the relationship between the great powers and the ocean. Operation Deadlight. When the war ended and the Allies began receiving the surrender of German submarines, they faced an unexpected dilemma. There were too many U-boats. More than 150 units had been surrendered intact or partially operational, and while many were useful for analysis and experimentation, most represented a logistical and strategic problem. Maintaining them was expensive, dismantling them was slow, and allowing any to return to German hands or worse, potentially fall into enemy hands in the future, was unacceptable to the victorious powers. The war was over, but the military balance remained fragile. Faced with this reality, one of the largest and least-known naval operations of the post-war period was born, Operation Deadlight. Deadlight was the code name given to the process of almost completely eliminating the remaining German submarine fleet. The decision was made jointly by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, who agreed that only a small number of submarines would be preserved for technical studies or special tests. The rest had to be destroyed. No trace was to remain of the naval force that had caused so much damage to Allied maritime trade during the war. For the British, who led the operation, sinking the captured submarines was the quickest and most practical way to ensure they would never sail again. The submarines destined for Operation Deadlight were concentrated in several British ports, including Lisahally in Northern Ireland and Loch Ryan in Scotland. There, long rows of U-boats were moored side by side in a precarious state. Most had been delivered with little fuel, some with combat damage, and many with depleted batteries. The German crews had been withdrawn and replaced by Allied sailors tasked with overseeing the transfers and preparing the vessels for their final destination. The Allies planned 3 methods for sinking them: towing them out to sea and destroying them with explosives placed on board, using them as targets in bombing and artillery practice, or simply opening valves and hatches so they would sink on their own. However, the operation faced difficulties from the outset. Many submarines were in such poor condition that towing them became a dangerous undertaking. The North Atlantic storms, frequent at that time of year, caused several U-boats to sink before reaching the designated areas. Often, Allied ships had to cut the tow cables to avoid accidents, leaving the submarines to disappear into the swell. Despite the setbacks, Operation Deadlight continued for months. One by one, the submarines were towed to scuttling areas located between 50 and 100 kilometers offshore. Once there, Royal Navy units carried out the final protocol. In some cases, the submarines were riddled with artillery fire. In others, depth charges detonated near the hull, causing massive ruptures. The explosions made the water vibrate as the steel silhouettes slowly tilted toward the ocean. Several Allied crews watched as entire submarines disappeared vertically, as if the sea was swallowing them without resistance. There were times when the U-boats sank so quickly that there was barely time to record their identification numbers. Sinking them wasn't just a military procedure. For many Allied sailors, it held symbolic significance. For years, U-boats had posed a constant threat. They had sunk thousands of ships, crippled shipping lanes, and caused the deaths of tens of thousands of sailors. Watching them disappear beneath the waves was, for some, a way to close a painful and dark chapter of the war. However, there was also a strange feeling among the witnesses. Many of the submarines were so advanced that destroying them seemed a waste. It was like sinking pieces of engineering that would never be replicated. As the months passed, the operation progressed until virtually the entire German submarine fleet was eliminated. By 1946, more than 100 U-boats had been sunk. Some sank accidentally during storms. Others were deliberately destroyed with explosives or used as targets for torpedo testing. Only a few survived, destined for museums, studies, or naval experiments. The rest lay at the bottom of the Atlantic, scattered across a vast underwater graveyard. What makes Operation Deadlight particularly fascinating is that for decades its story remained relatively unknown. Many of the submarine's sinking sites remained unexplored, buried under layers of sediment and in near-zero oxygen, which remarkably preserved the hulls. In recent years, deep-diving expeditions and underwater vehicles have located several of these wrecks. Some are virtually intact, frozen in time from the exact moment they were abandoned to the depths. These modern explorations have revealed surprising details. Many vessels rest in perfect positions as if they were still on patrol. The turrets are still visible, the torpedo tubes remain closed, and the hatches show the final wear of their sinking. Some images captured by underwater robots evoke the feeling that the past still breathes beneath the waters of the Atlantic. But beyond history, there is also danger. Many of these submarines retain fuel remnants, deteriorated batteries, and unexploded torpedoes, making them potential chemical bombs hidden on the seabed. Despite this, Operation Deadlight remains one of the most significant episodes in the closing stages of World War II. It not only represents the practical end of the German submarine fleet, but also the beginning of a new era. With the destruction of the Reich's U-boats, the Allies consolidated their technological dominance and paved the way for the development of modern submarines that would redefine the military balance throughout the Cold War. The remains of deadlight, scattered across the ocean depths, remain as silent monuments to a conflict whose consequences are still felt today. Missing subs and myths. Despite meticulous Allied record-keeping and exhaustive counts conducted after the German surrender, a significant number of Third Reich submarines never reappeared in any port, nor were they officially counted among those surrendered or destroyed. This absence fueled an aura of mystery surrounding the missing U-boats from the very beginning. Some were lost in more or less explainable ways during the final, chaotic months of the war, but others simply vanished without a trace, without remains, without any final communication, leaving a historical void that would eventually transform into myth, speculation, and legend. Historians note that the final days of the Reich were marked by a collapse in logistics and communication. Many submarines operated in isolation without receiving updated orders, with deteriorating radios and critically low supplies. However, even considering the chaos, some disappearances are difficult to explain. Submarines that departed on precise courses sent regular communications for weeks and then abruptly vanished without any apparent technical explanation. Rough seas, an undocumented air attack, or a fatal malfunction could have been responsible in some cases, but the complete lack of physical evidence opened the door to all sorts of theories. One of the most persistent stories revolves around the U-boats that supposedly sailed to South America after the surrender. In Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, rumors circulated for decades about sightings of submarines surfacing on remote beaches during the winter of 1945. Some accounts spoke of German sailors hastily disembarking, burning documents, and fleeing inland. Most of these stories were never verified and often came from indirect sources. However, on certain occasions, curious evidence emerged. Corroded metal remains found in coastal areas, blurry photographs taken by fishermen, or reports from local authorities about unusual maritime activity during those weeks following the end of the war. The historical presence of German immigrants in various regions of the Southern Cone further fueled these speculations. Some authors argued that certain submarines may have been used to transport Nazi officials, scientists, or even regime treasures to clandestine shelters built in remote locations. And although official documentary evidence lacks confirmation in most of these cases, the mixture of fragmentary facts and popular narratives transformed each trace into a piece of an irresistible puzzle for researchers and adventurers. But South America isn't the only place on the map of myths. In the North Atlantic, near Iceland and Greenland, the story of phantom submarines detected decades after the war's end persists. Sailors of various nationalities reported seeing dark silhouettes underwater, elongated metallic structures that seemed to move with eerie slowness. When they approached to identify the object, it vanished without a trace. Some attributed it to optical illusions caused by turbulent waters, others to the remains of sunken submarines that surfaced temporarily due to internal pressures. But for many, the shadow of the lost U-boat remained the best explanation. There is also the case of the alleged coded messages received by radio stations in the Atlantic well into June 1945. These were brief signals in the telegraphic style characteristic of the Kriegsmarine, although their origin could never be determined. The most likely interpretation is that they were transmissions from merchant ships, atmospheric interference, or simple decoding errors. But for enthusiasts of naval mysteries, these radio pulses were definitive proof that some U-boats had continued operating in secret. The myths grew even more with the belated discovery of submarines that were thought to be lost. On several occasions, vessels sunk during the war were found decades later in locations completely different from those indicated in official records. The discrepancies between the documentation and the actual locations generated suspicions of negligence, cover-ups, or record manipulation in the period immediately following the Allied victory. Some researchers argue that the Allies concealed the true location of certain submarines for strategic reasons, especially those equipped with technology considered too advanced or vessels involved in sensitive operations. Over time, the missing U-boats became fertile ground for increasingly outlandish theories. From alleged secret bases in Antarctica to tales of submarines supposedly carrying hidden relics or experimental machines, popular imagination elevated what were likely maritime tragedies to almost mythical proportions. Yet behind every exaggeration lies a kernel of historical doubt, the certainty that not all missing submarines have been explained, and that the vast ocean may hold secrets that written history either failed or chose not to record. The truth likely lies somewhere between logic and legend. Many of these submarines were lost to natural causes: impossible storms, underwater collisions, internal explosions, battery system failures, or enemy attacks that were never recorded. Others may have been misclassified, or their remains still rest at inaccessible depths where no human diver has ever descended. But until the fate of each one is clarified, as long as stories, isolated testimonies, and maps with incomplete routes exist, the missing U-boats will continue to evoke a unique blend of mystery, tragedy, and fascination. Ultimately, these lost submarines symbolize more than just stray war machines. They represent the blurred boundary between established history and maritime myth, that space where the ocean reclaims its own secrets and where the silences of the past allow legends to survive. There, in the unfathomable territory of what was never recovered, the vanished U-boats continue to sail in the collective imagination, like lingering shadows of a war that still leaves questions unanswered. The legacy. The legacy of German submarines after World War II became one of the fundamental pillars upon which modern submarine warfare was built. Although the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, its naval engineering left a mark that would endure for decades. The end of the conflict did not mean the disappearance of the U-boats, but rather the beginning of a new era in which their design, operational philosophy, and technological innovations would be absorbed, studied, and transformed by the world's major powers. The impact of this legacy was so profound that the evolution of submarines during the Cold War, and even today, cannot be understood without first examining the revolution initiated by German engineers. In the final years of the war, Germany had committed to a radical transformation of its submarine fleet. The limitations of the traditional propulsion system, which forced submarines to surface frequently, made them easy targets for Allied aircraft. In response, Kriegsmarine engineers developed a new generation of vessels capable of prolonged underwater navigation without surfacing. The result of this effort was the Type 21, a submarine ahead of its time in almost every respect. Its hydrodynamic design, extended submerged capability, and rapid battery recharging system marked a qualitative leap that would forever change the very concept of submarine warfare. When the Allies captured these submarines, they realized they weren't dealing with mere war machines, but with prototypes containing the DNA of future technology. The United States used several of them as experimental models, testing their performance under different conditions and disassembling them piece by piece to understand the principles that made them so efficient. This analysis led to a series of improvements applied to the first American submarines of the Cold War. The U.S. Navy itself acknowledged that the Type 21 had been the conceptual starting point for its modern fleet. In the United Kingdom, the captured submarines inspired entire redesign programs. British engineers accustomed to more traditional models were astonished by the German submarine's silent movement and its ability to operate almost completely submerged for extended periods. This discovery forced a complete overhaul of manuals, doctrines, and training methods. British combat tactics were modified to include maneuvers that mimicked German capabilities. Even anti-submarine systems were redesigned because until then, most were designed to detect submarines that spent more time on the surface than underwater. The Soviet Union, for its part, seized the opportunity to modernize its fleet, which had become obsolete during the conflict. Soviet engineers thoroughly studied the captured models and applied those advancements to the development of their own classes of submarines, which would later become one of the most powerful forces in the world. In this respect, the German influence was direct. The first post-war Soviet submarines copied systems, internal designs, and structures inspired by the Type 21. This legacy would be essential for the subsequent development of Soviet nuclear submarines, which would compete directly with the Americans in the Cold War naval arms race. But the legacy wasn't limited to visible technology. It also extended to strategic thinking. The Germans had developed an operational philosophy based on speed, mobility, and underwater autonomy. Instead of viewing the submarine as a vessel that alternated between surface and submerged, They conceived of it as a true submerged predator, capable of carrying out entire missions without surfacing. This idea transformed the military doctrine of all the world's powers. From then on, the world's navies began designing fleets intended to operate in absolute silence, prioritizing constant submersion and minimizing any dependence on the surface. One of the most influential elements was the snorkel, a technology that allowed submarines to use diesel engines while submerged at shallow depths. Although not entirely a German invention, the Reich perfected and implemented it on a large scale, giving its submarines unprecedented range. This system was adopted by the Allied fleets and used for years before the advent of nuclear reactors. In a sense, the snorkel can be considered a transitional technology that overcame the limitations of the classic submarine and brought it closer to the modern nuclear submarine model. Battery systems, hydroacoustic sensors, internal compartment layouts, evacuation mechanisms, and modular assembly methods were also adopted by the Allies. Even the ergonomics of German controls would influence the design of future submarine command cabins. While some of these details may seem trivial, together they represented a quiet revolution that made life aboard modern submarines more efficient and safer. At a strategic level, the German legacy extended into the psychological realm as well. The U-boat threat had demonstrated that a relatively small fleet, equipped with advanced technology and operating from the shadows, could challenge much larger powers. This lesson did not go unnoticed. During the Cold War, both the United States and the USSR understood that a powerful submarine force could alter the global geopolitical balance, not only through direct attacks but also through deterrence. The notion of a submarine capable of launching missiles, hiding for months, and remaining invisible to the enemy was indirectly born from the lessons learned from the conflict with Germany. The legacy also left its mark on smaller countries. France, Japan, Sweden, Italy, and other European nations incorporated German technologies in their transition to new submarine models. In many cases, the post-war development of these fleets was directly influenced by engineers who had studied with or succeeded German technicians, or who had received technical documentation captured at the end of the war. Some of the naval cooperation treaties signed in the following decades included clauses on the use, analysis, and adaptation of U-boat technologies. Even today, when nuclear submarines dominate the oceans, traces of German engineering from World War II can still be found. The shape of the hulls, the internal organization of the propulsion sections, the philosophy of total stealth, and the importance of automation all stem from that era. In a sense, modern submarines are not descendants of the great surface battleships, but rather of the silent technological progress that Germany fostered in the darkness of war. The legacy of German submarines was not merely a collection of technical advancements, but a complete transformation in how nations understood control of the seas. What began as a desperate effort by the Reich to change the course of the conflict ultimately became the foundation of a new era of global naval power. Every advancement, every idea, and every design spread across the world like a seed that germinated in the arsenals of every superpower. Underwater warfare was forever changed by them, and although the regime that created them vanished in ruins, its technological shadow continues to silently navigate the depths of every ocean. As we approach the end of this extensive journey, the fate of German U-boats after World War II emerges as a dark mirror reflecting not only the last gasps of the Third Reich, but also the dawn of an entirely new era. The U-boats, machines designed for destruction and total war, ended up becoming an unexpected legacy that shaped geopolitics, naval technology, and the collective imagination of the 20th century and beyond. Their story is not limited to sinkings, battles in the Atlantic, or the desperate tactics of the conflict. It also encompasses their dissolution, their study, their disappearance, and their extraordinary influence on the future. When the German U-boats surrendered, were destroyed, or sank forever into the silence of the ocean, a traumatic chapter in human history came to an end. But their physical disappearance was not enough to erase their impact. Operation Deadlight, which sought to eliminate the last vestige of the Nazi submarine force, became a kind of massive funeral ceremony in the waters of the North Atlantic. More than 100 steel hulls descended into the depths as the ocean's surface closed over them like a liquid tombstone. Yet even in that sinking, each submarine that vanished left behind unanswered questions, fragments of knowledge yet to be discovered, and a legacy that would be reclaimed by the victorious powers. The missing U-boats and the myths that arose around them fueled the fascination of the entire world. Stories of phantom submarines, secret routes to South America, high-ranking officials who escaped under the cover of the ocean, and radio signals detected after the war had ended were woven into a narrative that spoke not only of technology, but also of mystery, fear, and hope. These tales reflected a simple fact. The war had left so many scars that the world was willing to believe almost anything. And the ocean, with its unfathomable vastness, became the perfect stage for the human imagination to soar freely among submerged metallic shadows. But beyond the myth, historical reality confirmed something even more momentous. German engineering had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in submarine warfare. Their vision, that of a submarine designed to live underwater, not just to submerge temporarily, forever transformed the world's naval architecture. The Allies studied those designs, replicated their principles, adopted their advancements, and built upon them the foundations of nuclear-powered submarines, silent navigation systems, and the doctrine of strategic stealth that would dominate the Cold War. In a way, technology conceived for destruction became the backbone of a global military balance based on mutual deterrence. The legacy of German submarines lies not only in the technical influence they exerted on the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the other naval powers. It also lies in the profound understanding of how a nation, even in total defeat, can alter the course of the future through its technological obsession. What began as a tool of war ended up being a source of knowledge that fueled innovations no one could have imagined in 1939. In the depths of the ocean lie the remnants of its physical history: corroded hulls, metal fragments devoured by salt, objects trapped in sediment unseen for 80 years. Each of these remnants is a time capsule, continuing to tell a silent story. But on the surface, in laboratories, shipyards, and naval bases around the world, its legacy lives on in the form of ideas, concepts, and technological lessons that transcended its time. Today, as nuclear submarines patrol the seas with capabilities never dreamed of by sailors during World War II, it is still possible to recognize in them the distant shadow of the German U-boats. From the hydrodynamic shape of their hulls to the operational philosophy that prioritizes absolute stealth, from the sensors that scan the ocean to the high-pressure survival systems, the echoes of the past remain. Every modern dive carries with it a fragment of that era that forever changed the role of the submarine in war and peace. The story of German submarines after the war is ultimately a story of transformation. It chronicles how machines born to destroy became tools that propelled global technological advancement. It tells how the defeat of a regime left an unexpected legacy, one that shaped the world's military structure for decades. And it is also proof that, even buried beneath kilometers of water, objects from the past can have a lasting impact on the future. The closing of this chapter is not an end, but a pause before an ocean of stories yet to be told. Because as long as modern submarines exist, as long as the silence of the deep continues to be explored by invisible vessels, and as long as the remnants of the past continue to rest in the marine darkness, the legacy of the U-boats will live on. Not as a symbol of war, but as a demonstration of how history, technology, and humanity can intertwine in ways that transcend victory or defeat. The ocean's depths hold bodies, but the depths of history hold ideas. And ideas, even those born in times of destruction, continue to sail through the centuries. That is perhaps the true legacy of the German U-boats, a reminder that what we build, for better or for worse, always finds a way to continue sailing in the world's memory.